Meaning, thank you so much to the Hunt Institute for convening this important discussion and for you all for joining. I'm going to ask that you put your name, title, and location in the chat so we can get a sense of who all is here as I welcome our speakers today. First is Dr. Rucker Johnson. He's the Chancellor's Professor of Public Policy in the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley, and Faculty Research Associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. As a labor economist who specializes in the economics of education, Johnson's work considers the role of poverty and inequality in affecting life's chances. His research and writing has been so influential to the way that we understand school integration and resource equity that I'm honored to say that he's also a member of the Brown's Promise Advisory Board. Next, Ari Americaner is the co-founder and executive director for Brown's Promise. Previously, Ari served in federal and state education administrations, as well as a vice president for the Education Trust. Ari is an education policy leader with expertise in finance, advocacy, and the law. Finally, I'm Dr. Stephen Owens, the Director of Policy and Advocacy for Brown's Promise. We're a new organization housed under the Southern Education Foundation that works hand in hand with local communities across the country to develop region-specific strategies for building integrated and equitable public schools. Now, as Jarvis mentioned, this year we mark the 70th anniversary of Brown v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court's landmark ruling, which famously declared that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Brown did more than just end legal segregation, however, in America's public schools. It made a powerful case that public education is a core function of government and that it's essential for preparing students from all backgrounds for success in their communities and careers. Now, you may see that black and white photograph make some assumptions about the timeliness about school integration. So let's see if you're right. In a 2023 national poll, how many Americans said that they favored the proposal to reorganize school districts to have more racially and economically diverse student bodies? I want to hear your answers, but don't put it in the chat yet. Just A, B, or C. A being 62%, B being 52%. C is 42%. Type it into the chat box, and we're all going to hit enter at the same time because I don't want you to be influenced by other people's answers. So how many Americans favor the policy here of reorganizing school districts for racial and economic integration? If you've got your answer, we're going to hit enter on the count of three. 1, 2, 3, go. Okay. Seeing a lot of B's and C's, and happy to point out that the answer is A. 62% of those surveyed favor this proposal. What I want to show you is that the idea of school integration is popular, and as I hope that we can prove here, absolutely necessary. In the early aftermath of the Brown decision, segregation did decrease rapidly. But progress toward integration peaked in the 1980s, and we have been backsliding ever since. Schools today are more racially segregated than they were in the 1970s, and that's partly because of other Supreme Court decisions since Brown that have made it harder for the federal government to tackle school segregation. If we zoom into the last 35 years, you can get a better picture of the resegregation of America's public schools, a stat that has grown even as residential segregation has eased slightly. Now, before I hand over to Professor Johnson to talk about the impacts of resource equity and school integration, I want to recognize that court-ordered desegregation did not come without a cost, costs that were overwhelmingly borne by Black and Brown communities as a continuation of white supremacist policies. However, we can and must create and advance policies that center the experiences of these students, specifically the students that have been and continue to be marginalized in education today. And today is when we must start. Studies have found that segregation leads to prejudice, which of course is destructive in its own right, but also that prejudice leads to reduced support for the American experiment, for democracy itself. Integrated schools are crucial to the foundational ways that we determine who gets what in our society. And if we do nothing, we will continue an unequal and unjust system that deny students opportunities based on race and class. Reports like the most recent from the Southern Education Foundation, Miles to Go, puts this such situation in sharp relief. With that, I'm going to hand it to Dr. Johnson to talk about the true impact of resource equity and school integration. Dr. Johnson?
Thanks so much. It's so great to be with you all. I'm just getting ready to share my screen. Hoping you all can see the screen, yes? All right. Well, without further ado, thank you for Stephen for that wonderful introduction to the real key issues. You know, racial economic convergence in the U.S. has proceeded at a glacial pace. And really, if there were no racial differences in socioeconomic mobility from one generation to the next, the speed of racial economic convergence would be more than twice the observed rate that we've witnessed and experienced from 1870 to the present. In other words, racial disparities in income have declined at less than half the speed that would have been expected over the past 150 years if there were not such large racial differences in generational mobility. And so the puzzle, what explains the slow speed of racial economic convergence and accounts for why the socioeconomic success of Black Americans have consistently and substantially lagged behind those of white Americans who began their lives in otherwise comparable familial economic circumstances. Now, what I want to kind of highlight here is that the puzzle that is as to why that has occurred is informed by the observed pattern in every American metropolitan area that Black and white families with children who have identical household income routinely reside in schools in neighborhoods that look nothing alike in terms of available resources. Now, what I first want to just highlight is the persistence of poverty lasts much longer for Black families, that using the panel study of income dynamics, following children for more than 50 years in terms of across 3 generations from birth to adulthood, we can show that for white adults, the likelihood of being in the bottom 20% of the income distribution, 15% of whites versus 37% of Blacks. But notice that the likelihood of an individual as an adult, we're looking at millennials now born between 1977 and 1995, that they're in adulthood poor, but their parents were also in the bottom 20% of the income distribution. Notice how among whites, that's less than 5%, 4%, and for Blacks is almost a quarter, 24%, 23 to 24%. And notice that 3 generational poverty, that is adults who are poor, their parents were poor, and their grandparents are poor. Notice that almost 17% of Blacks have that profile, whereas less than 1% for whites. So what I just want to first highlight is that the proportion of Black families are being overrepresented among the persistently poor across generations. So in this particular national representative sample that don't include Hispanics, it's about 17% of Black families in this sample. But notice that among those that are poor, it's about 35%. Among those whose parents and adults are both poor, it's about 55%. And notice that among poor adults today whose parents were poor and their grandparents are poor, more than 75% of those families are Black. And so what we really want to highlight is that's connected to the access to quality schools, that when we look at how many Blacks have experienced high racial school segregation for multiple generations, that we see, again, in this sample, roughly 17% of the sample is Black, but among those whose parents were hyper segregated schools, it's about 47%. Among Black millennials, about 30%. And among Black millennials whose parents also had high racial segregation, it's about 24%. And notice that if your parents had high segregation in their childhood, that their children, that is millennials, also about 50% likelihood of experiencing high segregation in their generation. So this is the first time we've been able to connect across 3 generations, really, the both childhood experiences, but also the school settings. And notice that the confinement of poorly funded schools persists much longer for Black children than white children. And we see this in terms of by looking at the likelihood that parents' childhood school was in the bottom 25% of the per pupil spending distribution. And we see that that's true for roughly a third of African-American families and less than 25% of white families. And again, both generations being in poorly funded schools. It's about 20% for African Americans and about 10 to 11% for from Blacks. And again, if your parents were in poorly funded schools, the likelihood that their children were in poorly funded schools is very significant. We're talking about roughly 65% for African Americans. And so the key thing is when we look at the solutions, the three myths of school integration, we tried it for a long time. You hear it didn't work. You hear it's no longer relevant. Well, we want to first highlight it's only a 15-year window that we really pursued in a very intensive way. Certainly still with a lot of flaws in implementation, which is the last mile of the pieces. But when we look at that kind of timing of integration, this is where we were on the eve of the Brown decision, and you can certainly see the strong regional pattern where legal segregation was required. But when you look at the kind of timing and where we look at desegregation in the mapping of when the court orders occurred, and really no integration occurred without such a court order. And we see that acceleration after the 64 Civil Rights Act put teeth in enforcement. We see that acceleration reaching peak integration in the late 80s, 1988, as Stephen said. And then we see a significant retrenchment in terms of release from the court orders, returning to neighborhood schools, and much more driven by the residential segregation patterns that have persisted. And so what we do in the study is first look at the first generation cohort who were born between 1950 and 1975 that have been followed into adulthood. And you can see that the timing of the court order, there was no pre-existing time trends, but a significant decline in racial school segregation. And that prior to the court orders, per pupil spending was at the district level was disproportionately allocated to the majority white schools within the district, and that the court order desegregation led to about a 20 to 25% increase in per pupil spending for children experiencing integration throughout their school age years relative to children from the same cohorts, the same school districts prior to the court orders. And notice how that then subsequently led to significant improvements in educational attainment that had a dose response, that each additional year of exposure, we're seeing an additional increment that's leading to about a full year of completed education, more than previous cohorts from the same schools prior to the court orders. And notice that all of those gains for Blacks didn't come at the expense of whites. It's not a zero-sum game, but that equity is improving educational outcomes that then led to significant translation into the labor market, significant improvements in earnings. We're talking about a 30% increase in earnings, again, with no negative impacts for whites. When we look at how this is connected to intergenerational ability and just focus on children whose parents were in the bottom half of the income distribution, notice that upward mobility as measured by the change in the rank in your generation relative to the rank of your parents in the income distribution in their generation, notice that it's a significant improvement in intergenerational ability, despite that Black-white disparity there, that kind of much more accelerated convergence happening in the 60s, 70s because of the integration. We then document how the court orders significantly increased that generational mobility, about a 10 point increase in the generational change in income rank across generations. And the key thing is we're following all of these children, but now we're able to look at the multi-generational impacts of desegregation by looking at their children, what I affectionately call the grandchildren of Brown. And here we look at the parents' exposure to court-ordered desegregation and its timing, again on the left, the pre-existing time trend prior to the court orders. And then notice on the right, the number of years after the experience that the parents had. Notice this is the impact on the next generation's children's school segregation. And we're seeing significant reductions, not only in the parents' generation, but that transmitted themselves into the next generation in terms of their children are in more integrated school environments, and in school environments that have higher per pupil spending in the next generation. We're talking about a 10 to 15% increase in per pupil spending among the next generation children's school spending, with no negative impacts for white children. And this then led to, for the next generation, about a full half year to full year grade completed years of schooling for the next generation. And that significantly improved the children's economic mobility in the next generation. I'm talking about a 10 percentage point difference in terms of the income rank in adulthood of their children relative to the grandparents' income rank in their generation. And again, none of these coming at the detriment of whites. And really, I'm going to leave it to Ari to highlight how school integration and school resource equity are significant complements and have significant complementarities in improving these educational outcomes. And just in the interest of time, let me make sure I close here so that we can do a good handoff and make sure that we have good time to be able to interact together in this webinar setting. So let me just hand off to Ari. There's a lot of components about how bringing a two-generation strategies to scale and the complementarity of public pre-K investments, school resource equity, and integration that are not being pursued in a strategic way, but that states can pursue. So thank you, and let me hand off to Ari.
Wow. Thank you, Professor Johnson. I feel like we often the story that we tell about why integration matters and works is, I mean, I find it very compelling just to say it works because it improves outcomes for kids, both in terms of academics and college going and life income expectancy, and to now be able to talk about the intergenerational effects with your new research and findings is really just incredibly powerful. And I'm really excited to dive in. So I can't wait for you to get that all published and out in the world so that we can all learn from it more deeply. But thank you for sharing that. It's amazing. So I'm going to share my screen too, because we all have PowerPoints. So here we go. Okay, so if Professor Johnson grounded us in why we should care about school integration and resource equity, why it matters for kids and their kids and intergenerational well-being, I want to shift and talk about what we can do together to actually make that vision of integrated, well-resourced schools, as was promised by Brown 70 years ago, an actual reality. And it's a lot, right? It's complicated. Nothing in education is simple, and we don't want to pretend that it is simple. We need to do quite a lot of things at the same time. And for me, it is often helpful for my brain to think about that in a metaphor. So if you will bear with me, we're going to talk about gardening for just a second. And I think it's going to be helpful. Anybody who's ever planted anything knows that we have to work with constrained resources, right? There is only so much land in your backyard. There is only so much light that gets through the trees in certain places. There's only so much water that falls from the sky in any given year, or that you have time to add, right? We have to figure out how to maximize the output and the outcomes from our constrained resources. And you can adjust any one of those things and make a difference, make something grow better. But the magic comes from doing it all at the same time, from figuring out how to make your garden work by matching the seeds you plant to the local soil, to the exact right kind of light at the exact right time of year. When you do it all together, that's where the magic happens. And the same thing is true in public education. We need to think about everything from the district lines that we draw to what happens within districts in terms of how we assign students and resources to schools, to the school funding that underlies all of the work, to the policy ecosystem that allows us to continuously improve, to the really constantly, we need to be focusing on the actual student experience of going to school and what that feels like. And I will say we are often not very good at that. So we have to continue to center that in our conversation. So I'm going to go through each one of those, but I just want to, if I leave you with nothing else, what I want to leave you with is this idea that there are no silver bullets and that we have to think about doing this wholesale and thinking about it all together. Okay, so first, funding schools fully and fairly. School funding is the water in our garden analogy. Okay, so anyone who tells you that funding is all we need to solve what's happening in public education is wrong. But just like water, good luck getting anything to grow without it, right? We have to fairly and fully fund our public schools if we're going to actually have a chance at anything else working in our schools. We have to start with that. And I think you all probably know this, but I just want to start by saying nationwide, we still live in a country where nearly half of our funding for schools comes from local sources. So think about property taxes and sales taxes. And I think a lot of people know that. They know that that means that, because I've heard politicians say that too often the quality of a kid's school is dependent on the zip code that they were born into, right? We kind of have this idea in our head. But I want to push us to refine what we mean when we think about local, to not just mean zip code in the way we talk about it in a speech, but to think specifically about school districts. It matters what school district you're born into. And that's because school districts are how we fund schools. So what states can do here is work to disconnect the happenstance, chance, lottery of what district you were born into and the amount of funding that's available to your school. And they can do that in two ways. The first is they can redefine what local means. So in this case, you can think about a larger geographic area instead of a single school district. Think about countywide pooling, for example, for school funding systems. And you can also shift entirely away from local funding, replacing those funds with state revenue for education. And I want to just note that we have a Brown's Promise policy agenda that this is pulling from, and we have specific examples of each of these things and where they're working, where states are working toward this. And you'll see those states highlighted in the little map on the screen. We won't go through every example, but I do want to show you this one because I think it's so important. In the early 2000s, the Nebraska state legislature created a new entity altogether called the Omaha Learning Community. And the goal was exactly this idea that we're talking about, regionalizing the responsibility for funding, for the local part of funding for public schools. So they said the Omaha Learning Community is an entity that is going to fund public schools across 11 school districts. These 11 school districts sit across 2 different counties, and they're going to share their local funding. Now, the other part of the funding from the state and the feds, that's all still going to come in. We're not touching that, but we're rethinking our local funding. We're also going to create a diversity-driven inter-district transfer program for students. And we're going to invest money in early childhood and after-school opportunities for low-income students. So for those of you who are familiar with Professor Johnson's book, Children of the Dream, you'll see sort of all 3 legs of the stool here that he talks about: early childhood, funding, and integration all at once. And they tried to tackle them all together. And it wasn't perfect, but it was incredibly innovative. It lasted about a decade before political winds shifted. And there's so much that we can learn from this approach and think about importing into our policy solutions and conversations today. So if that's the school funding, the water of our garden, what we push resources into schools, we also want to talk about pulling students to resources, rethinking the school district lines themselves. So this is like the garden bed in your garden, quite literally, like, where do you build the raised bed? What shape is it in? Where do you draw your plot lines in your garden, right? We don't think enough or talk enough about district lines in our country, is my proposition to you. We talk a lot about congressional districts and how they were drawn, and we fight about them every 10 years, every time we have a new census. They actually share a lot of things in common. They're a lot about how we allocate resources. They're a lot about race. They're a lot about socioeconomic status and who lives where. This is the Birmingham City Public School District in Alabama. It looks a lot like, I think, of many gerrymandered congressional districts. But we talk about congressional districts all the time. We don't talk about school districts all the time. Just like congressional districts, school districts are not handed down by some higher power. They are creatures of state policy. They can be changed, and we should be talking about that. And it's important that we talk about that because these district lines are responsible for about 60% of all school segregation today. That's a lot of the school segregation we see today. It's happening because of district lines. So if we aren't talking about that, we're not even talking about half of the segregation in our country's public schools. So what we can do here, I'm going to say there's 3 things we can do at the state level. The first is we can enroll students across those lines. Those lines are not the Great Wall of China. We can think intentionally about creating well-designed transfer programs or magnet school programs that enroll across a region, regardless of what district a student lives in. Now, emphasis on well-designed. Uncontrolled choice can often lead to more segregation, but well-designed programs with transportation and a diversity-centered focus can really do amazing things here. The second thing is you can just change the district lines altogether. think about shifting to countywide school districts like they had in West Virginia, where I grew up, or in Florida, truly countywide districts. A lot of states in the South think they have countywide districts, but they have so many exceptions and carve-outs that it's not actually true. And then the third thing is we could strengthen what are called anti-secession laws. And that means basically trying to keep things from getting worse. So making it much harder for individual hyperlocal communities to secede from their school district and create their own, making the problem even worse, more segregated and more hyperlocal. I want to show you one more example because in this context, which is Hartford, Connecticut. They have the largest interdistrict transfer program and magnet program in our country. It's been around for many decades. They serve more than 40,000 students every year in either interdistrict enrollment programs or interdistrict public magnet schools. That is more than half of Hartford students attending these diversity-driven interdistrict regional school programs. That's a lot of kids for one region over a long period of time. And so it is absolutely worth studying. And early results are very promising. They are seeing higher outcomes for kids, both academic outcomes, but also reported experiential outcomes, feeling like they belong, feeling safe, access to math and world languages, college going, cross-cultural friendships, all these things in line with what Professor Johnson's research showed when he looked over many years across the country. And I want to also note one thing that has gone down, which is absences, both students and teachers. And in this time where we are fighting against increases in chronic absenteeism across the country, that's a real notable outcome, I think. I also want to say it's not perfect. I don't know if anybody on this call is from Hartford, but if you talk to anybody from Hartford, they will tell you about the challenges of implementing this program over the years and the things that have the downsides, the unintended consequences that have come from it. But that's not a reason to not learn from it and pursue the best of what's working in other places, because there's so much good here and so many options for so many kids over the last years that they would not have otherwise had. Okay, so those first two bits of the garden analogy were, how do we assign kids and resources to school districts? Now we want to talk about, what do we do within the school districts? How do we ensure integration and resource equity within school district and schools? Essentially, how do we get the district leaders to do the right thing, right? We all know from growing up, from where we send our kids to school today, that we know anecdotally that there's often in any community, in any neighborhood, there's like the richer, tonier school over here and the poor school over here, right? Or there's the white school over here and the black school over here. We know that that is still how it feels when we think about our schools today. And that is true. It aligns with the data that we just saw about rising segregation. As you know, because you can all do this kind of math, if 60% of segregation is from district lines, the other 40% of segregation is within districts, right? So this is how districts assign kids to schools. But to add insult to injury, not only do districts across the country create sort of the poorer school over here, the school serving more students living in poverty over here, and the wealthier school over here, they also then do not provide additional resources to the school serving those higher concentrations of students living in poverty. That is crazy. Look at this statistic. This is from an Education Trust report not too long ago. They found that in virtually every single school district in America, spending per student is the same or lower in schools with greater poverty. That is wild. That is the definition of, we're never, ever, ever. We can say we believe as a district, our mission statement as a district can be equal opportunity for all. But if you are putting a bunch of your poor students in one school and not giving them any additional spending to meet that additional need, you are clearly not putting your money where your mouth is. That is just so obvious. So states, yes, these are district decisions, but states regulate districts all the time across all sorts of things. States can require local leaders to create assignment zones and budgets that promote integration and resource equity. And they can also provide the funding and technical support to help do this work, because it's hard. It is like undeniably hard work, and we need to provide the support and funding it takes to do the change management and to do that kind of work. All right, you didn't think I was going to do a garden analogy and not talk about the sun, I assume. So I'm going to talk about the sun for a minute. I don't know if any of you have ever like actually planted anything, but when I go to a nursery and try to buy a plant, you know, you see the labels that say like full sun, full shade, part sun, part shade. To this day, no matter how many times I ask my mom, I cannot understand the difference between part sun and part shade. But in any event, plants need different things, right? They need specific kinds of care and attention, and every student is the same way. And we have got to be focusing on what every student actually needs and gets, and what it is like to be a student in a school that is intentionally trying to integrate. Because if we don't, we recreate those concerns that Stephen mentioned at the top, which is the firing of Black teachers, or the putting of students in schools where they are not feeling welcome, not feeling safe, asking students of color to take long commutes. We can't do any of that, right? We have to be serious and intentional about this. So what I want to suggest to you is that when you leave this webinar, let's say you're excited, you're motivated, you're like, I'm going to put a meeting on the books with my team in the new year to talk about how we might do something on this, how we might study the creation of a new inter-district magnet program in some region of my state. That's amazing. And the second half of that agenda item in that meeting has to be, and how do we make sure that it feels good for students from day one? And here are our suggestions of what those three main things are you need to think about in that context. The first is, every single time you think about creating an integration program of any type or reorganizing schools in any way to advance integration, you think about, how do we make sure we have educators who are well prepared and ready to lead in that space, that have been trained on how to do school in an intentionally diverse setting, and specifically are diverse themselves. Real integration is about diverse student bodies, but also diverse adults in a school. Secondly, encouraging real community engagement from people who are most directly impacted and have most been served by or relegated to under-resourced public schools, asking them what they want, what kind of themes might be interesting in a magnet school program. And last, ensuring that all students have access to rigorous coursework, but also just good schooling. So we cannot recreate the school within a school situation where we have tracking that segregates kids inside of an intentionally diverse school. It doesn't count as a diverse integrated school if you've got all the white kids in the magnet program over here and everybody else in the program over here. So we have to really make sure that we are intentional about how we do within school integration. And that includes things like automatically enrolling every student who demonstrates readiness in advanced courses and honors programs, and a bunch of other sort of specific policy mechanisms. Okay, very last, and then I'll stop talking. We want to focus on creating an ecosystem that promotes integration and resource equity. This is so important. This is what we do if we're serious about long-term continuous improvement. If we know that there is no silver bullet in education. We know that leaders will change, elected and appointed leaders will change. We know that research will change. What we thought was the best possible practice is no longer becomes outdated. We know that things will evolve. What we need to do is set up policies and practices that help us continue to move forward, and to know that we are always going to be moving toward this bright line goal of integrated, well-resourced schools. This ecosystem is like the soil that we plant in. It has to be constantly encouraging new growth. So we think there are three things that you can do as state leaders to set the stage for this ecosystem sort of chain, a healthy ecosystem. The first is collecting and reporting data and visualizing it in the right ways. So we have some specific ideas about what that looks like on state report cards, how you can actually make it easy for community leaders and district leaders to see how segregated their schools are and how fairly or unfairly they are resourcing those schools. Holding district leaders accountable, literally changing your district accountability system. I bet you don't even know you have a district accountability system in most states. So changing your district accountability system to hold district leaders accountable for doing the right thing. And then taking advantage of federal programs. There are federal programs out there that will provide you with funding and resources to support this work, like the Magnet School Assistance Program. But there are also requirements, just core requirements in Title I. Sometimes it is helpful as a state or local leader to be able to, like, say the feds made me do it when something is hard or unpopular. So know those requirements and use them where it is appropriate to do so, and really use them to your advantage. Okay, so that was a lot. I know I was talking fast. I don't know if I talked faster or slower than Professor Johnson, but we both talked really fast. And I just want to close with this idea that one of the takeaways from this for us at Brown's Promise in the work of creating this policy agenda and pulling these examples together is that it is very possible to do this work. There are places doing this work all over the country. The key, though, is doing it all at the same time. And almost nobody's doing that. And if that is motivating to you and exciting to you, and you want to think about how to start to think holistically and plan a broad, holistic approach in your state or your place, we would love to have continued conversations about how we can be helpful in making that plan and implementing that plan, because that is what we think we really need to do if we're serious about fulfilling the promise of Brown these 70 years later. So with that, I think I can stop and turn it back to our friends at the Hunt Institute for questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Perfect. Thank you all so much. On the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A function, which should be next to tools. So on the bottom right of your bottom panel, you'll see a Q&A function. Feel free to drop your questions in there, or you can directly type your questions in the chat. So if you have any questions for any of our incredible experts today, please drop those in either the chat, or you can navigate yourself to the Q&A function on the bottom towards the right-hand side of that bottom panel.
While we're waiting on those questions, Ari, somebody messaged me in a direct message asking about the intersection of school integration policies and what we're seeing in a lot of school districts is declining enrollment, and asking if that maybe makes an opportunity or does that hamper attempts at school integration. Do you mind speaking just a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. What a timely and good question. We know that not every school district across the country, but in a lot of school districts across the country, this is a really live conversation and a really hard conversation right now. I think we do think that there is potential for district leaders to say, look, we are pragmatists. Our job is to operate a school district, and that means we have to balance our budget. We have to figure out how to spend the money we have in the places we have for the students we have. And if they say that means, if they're starting to think that might mean closing schools, then that is the hardest of all hard conversations in education. And we think that we're thinking about what a sort of an equity focused, but diversity and equity focused approach to that conversation might be. And I think this is preliminary, but some of the early thoughts that we're having are that, one, if I were in their shoes, if I were a school district leader, I would say, I'm going to start by saying I have a bright line principle here, which is that I'm not going to close any schools in my most under-resourced neighborhoods, because for too long we've expected those communities in under-resourced neighborhoods, and particularly Black communities, to shoulder the burden of closed schools. I would say I'm not doing that. And if we have to close schools, that means we'll have to find it somewhere else in our district. And if those schools are under-enrolled, those schools in the under-resourced neighborhoods, if they're under-enrolled because we've been under-investing in them, or because people have moved out, or for whatever reason they're under-enrolled, it's on us to figure out how to make them more welcoming and invite more students back. And that might mean inviting students from across the district. It might mean adding a magnet program, turning that school into a school-wide magnet program that provides a really cool opportunity, an early college program, or a STEAM, science, technology, engineering, arts, and math theme that serves all the students who are assigned to that school, and also invites in and gives priority in some sort of lottery district-wide any student who in a different neighborhood has had their local school closed. Like, let's give them priority access to join that school. But I think the bright line rule has to be, we are not going to ask our communities of color and our communities that have been most under-resourced for decades to shoulder disproportionately, or shoulder at all, the burden of school closings if they have to happen. And instead, we're going to invest in those schools and attract a more diverse student body back to them. So again, we see school diversity and school integration on the one hand, and school funding on the other hand, coming together as two sides of sort of the same coin. I don't mean to say that this is easy. Like, this is the hardest conversation, and there are no easy answers, but I do think thinking about if you have to be in that place and in that conversation, doing it with a really intense focus on equity and on diversity is the right way to be in that conversation.
Thank you. And Dr. Johnson, I know one of the things I've run into a lot as I'm trying to catalyze discussions around this in states is people will ask just how does it work? We see these huge impacts based on your research and the research of your colleagues, and I can visualize why resource equity would support students. I can imagine, better materials, higher paid teachers, things like that, a roof that doesn't leak. It's harder to imagine what is the actual change that takes place in school integration that supports student outcomes and in and then outside the classroom. Do you mind speaking just a little bit more about that, about the practical implementation of integration on students? Oh, you're on mute. I'm sorry.
Sorry. We always say, figuring out that last mile of policy reform is really policy implementation. And really at the core, it requires a holistic thinking around distinguishing desegregation from integration. Desegregation is the first step, but integration is kind of the embodiment of the teacher diversity that's requisite, the student diversity, the curricular rigor, and being able to ensure that it begins at the earliest grades and continues throughout the K-12 and even pre-K through 12 experience, that it embodies the kind of socio-emotional development and the nurturing and the things that go beyond just measuring test scores, and really fostering that kind of sense of the art of thinking individually together. And really that's the kind of the pieces that don't fully get captured in a quantitative test score, even the quantitative data that I was presenting today. It's really in the, as Ari's beautiful analogy with the soil and the synergy between the pre-K early advancements in opportunity, the sustaining those high quality environments in which kids can learn and grow, and doing it in environments where diverse perspectives are embraced as catalysts for more understanding across different groups, but also elevated kind of analytical thinking around how do we, what I think of is how do we maximize that diversity, meaning we're in a situation where our children have never been more diverse linguistically, socioeconomically. So it's just that we have not allowed, what I'm thinking is we haven't allowed the policy solutions that match the scale of the problem when we kind of focus on short-term kinds of things that really are not equity centered. And there's a way to do that that's not a zero-sum game. And so segregation just casts a long shadow. And that long shadow is such that anytime we see these achievement gaps, they grow when they start early and then they continue to grow during the school years, during the school age years. And so intervening early becomes a central component. And so while school resource equity is as central as the water, Ari was saying, it's also true that concentrated poverty schools, right, don't ensure that that school resource equity results in the actual equity of resources, because teachers are probably our most prized resource. And what we see in concentrated poverty schools is they have a much more difficult time attracting the best and brightest teachers in terms of preparedness, as well as the retention of those high quality teachers. And this is also true of the school principals and leaders and superintendents in those places are often having a much more high turnover. And so part of that means that thinking about socioeconomic diversity and the intersection of race and class and not just one or the other is really a central component of contemporary school integration efforts. And really, the one piece that Ari didn't have time to mention is really trying to incorporate housing policy and mixed income housing policies to ensure that it's not just the district lines, but that we can bring opportunity communities, children, and families by having more mixed income neighborhoods and supporting that with our housing policies. And so those are components, but it's something that we have to think of as a mission and a purpose that can have impacts that outlive us. That if we really do the kind of transformational policies that I'm talking about, the impact can outlive us. And that's really when I was highlighting these 3 generational, multi-generational impacts. It's in part because the lasting impacts of educational opportunity when it's expanded just has lasting impacts if we are able to have those synergies that I aforementioned.
Yeah, that's really well put. Something I hear from communities in highly segregated districts all the time is they feel like their teachers are either there for 1 to 2 years and then either get a job at the district right next door, or the challenges of concentrated poverty push them out of the classroom altogether. And that labor market, how we incentivize really harsh labor markets for these school districts, to Ari's point, is not talked about a lot. I'm going to offer this question to either one of you, but I imagine Dr. Johnson, you'll probably start with it. We mentioned some of the benefits to white middle-class students of attending integrated schools. Do you mind talking a little bit about what we've seen as benefits for these students who aren't usually talked about as like helping them in integrated schools?
Yeah, I think it's a lot about, I think of all good leaders at any level, business, law, right, government. Policy leaders need to be able to lead across difference, lead across the diversity. Children are inheriting a global, a global marketplace. And the question is whether we're preparing our students. And often we've thought college is the place where they get exposed to diversity. But what we're seeing in the recent evidence is that really the early pre-K through 12 school resource inequities are hampering efforts to build more diverse colleges and university communities. And so you have to begin early. Now, you asked the question earlier about, when I think about learning across difference, it's about, we find that racial prejudice, racial intolerance, those things are learned. They're not ingrained, but you have to have exposure in environments of equality, right? You don't really learn about race by hiring minorities to work for you. You learn about race by being in classroom experiences together to learn in those environments. And I would say the more qualitative research has been able to more lift that component that has, in terms of the benefits of integration, that don't get captured in the kind of markers that deal with educational attainment or test scores or even earnings. They're not fully captured in those barometers, but they certainly are very much about, like, what is the public mission of our schools? And that has to embody something beyond Stanford for mine, or because I'm at Berkeley and we're the best public university in the world, we prefer Berkeley, but what I'm saying is that the access part has to have the public good and public mission, not just a private return in mind. And I think we've lost a lot of that frame to why we do public schools and why they're so important. And that's a little bit why I'm a little concerned about charter school growth that is unregulated. And I think Ari was speaking to school choice without aligning with equity goals. And I think you can have school control choice that is still builds on choice, but has the pillars of equity in the center that center the student experience. So for all groups, not just the most privileged. Thank you
And
for that
maybe,
good question. And I should hand off to Ari because she has.
oh no,
Take that.
I just wanted to add one thing that is not based on the same kind of research. I mean, I know everything Rucker said about and more, right? There are amazing researchers who have studied the critical thinking skills that come from, and leadership skills that come from working in diverse teams and learning in diverse teams across lines of race, across lines of language, across lines of socioeconomic status. You literally learn to think better. You learn to lead better. You learn, but another thing you do is, and this is what I think Professor Johnson was starting to get at, but that we heard so loud and clear when we did focus groups and then public national message testing, when we asked families and parents about what they thought about this work. And what they said loud and clear was like, what I need for my kid is to be prepared for the workplace and prepared for the diverse workplace and communities that they're going to have to live and be in. And that is one of the few things that we as parents quite literally cannot give our kids by ourselves. Like, I cannot give my kid a diverse experience in my own home, or like I rely on the public schools, elementary schools that I send my kids to for that preparation. And it is critical. And parents made that very clear when we asked them these questions, both in focus groups and in national polling. And that was true across lines of race, across lines of of income, that parents see that that is something that they cannot provide themselves and need a public school to provide for them.
Those points are very well taken, and I'll just say from personal experience, going to very integrated schools in suburban Atlanta, that I benefited as a person to having Black kids that were smarter than me in AP Calc, to what it looked like to realize that kind of any biases that I brought to the classroom fall apart really quickly when these are like kids I'm going to school with, parents who I'm going to their house. And you're right, it was good for me as a person, not just as a a test taker. In that way, we have time for a quick answer to this question. If any of y'all have any resources or kind of a direction to point to this question about how can educators be better prepared to teach in diverse integrated classrooms?
I was waiting to see if you wanted to go first.
I'm gonna defer to Ari to start.
I think, well, it's funny. We have at Brown's Promise, we have this research advisory group, and we are working, and we put out a research agenda last year. And one of the questions in that research agenda is quite specifically, does going to a more integrated teacher preparation program prepare teachers to be better at teaching in diverse K-12 classrooms, and better defined how, and better for like particularly white teachers, if they go to an integrated teacher prep program, does that prepare them to be better teachers for students of color in integrated classrooms? So what I am saying is, I think this is a great question, and I think we have a lot more to learn about how to do this well. And I think there's probably some research and resources that I am not fully up to speed on, so I don't want to sort of pretend to answer that question.
It's a great one, though. I think teacher preparation in all of these ways is central. And yeah, I don't think I can do justice to the question in the time that we have. So yes, I think we'll just let it marinate so that we can continue to ponder on those things about the how to. A lot of this is about the what, why, and the how. And the what we try to center first. The why it's important, we try to center. The how, I think, is always kind of something where we're looking for North Stars of ways to kind of identify exemplars of the elements that in the soil, the sun, right, the water, and the integration of those pieces. So we think of integration not as just the policy, but the policy approach itself, integrating the pieces of pre-K, school resource equity, integration, teacher diversity, curricular quality, right? Those are pieces that integration embodies. So thank you for your time. And we're looking forward to the continued conversation and building a movement to finish the incomplete mission of integration.
Absolutely. Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Johnson, Ari. Thank you to the Hunt Institute. Professor Johnson mentioned it before, but if you have not yet, his book, Children of the Dream, very helpful to me to understand not only the basis of that decision, but the consequences of it and the confluence of resource equity, pre-K investments, school integration. I cannot recommend it highly enough. You're going to get resources after this from Brown's Promise of the State Policy Agenda that Ari was speaking from, which also have those citations that some of you asked for some of this really important work. Please fill out our survey to let us know how this went, how we can continue to adapt it to do right by those folks who are a part of the how, because this does not happen without the implementation of many people working towards this goal. And so thank you so much again for joining, and I hope you have a great rest of your Tuesday.